everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by my friends over at a company called Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com. Sky Chilton and his father, Jeff Chilton. I interviewed Jeff a number of episodes ago. Really interesting guys. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. And it's a company that sells and distributes medicinal mushrooms in powder or capsule form. I was really happy to have these guys come on. I think they were very much in alignment with the values of the podcast. As you all know, a big part of this podcast is about plant medicine, holistic medicine, and I think the benefits of medicinal mushrooms are truly fantastic, and I think there's really a growing body of work that's really showing and alluding to all of the amazing properties that mushrooms have. They sell a lot of different mushrooms, things you've probably heard of, like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. Those are all mushrooms I work with. They're part of what I consider for myself a really holistic supplement regime. And the thing I really love about their company, not only are they really good guys, I think they're really ethical guys, but the product is really amazing. It's all 100% mushrooms. They're organic, and that's really rare. For better or for worse, the supplement industry is highly unregulated, and so often when you get supplements, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You may be getting some mushroom, you may be getting a bunch of fillers and other things. Oftentimes, even when you're buying what may be a mushroom, it may not have any of that mushroom in it at all, unfortunately. Even some of the big, I think even the biggest company that sells mushrooms, actually it's not the fruiting body, not the mushroom itself. It's the mycelial, which is grown on grain, and then those things are mixed up and then sold in a supplement form. So not only are you not getting the mushroom itself, you're getting the mycelium mixed with grain. So it's one of the amazing things of Real Mushrooms is it's exactly that. It's real mushrooms. So it's 100% mushrooms, organic. So you're getting a really good product. You're getting the actual fruiting body, the mushroom itself, 100% of that. And again, just really great guys. I'm really happy to have them on and supporting this podcast. So if you'd like a really good product, you'd like to start working with medicinal mushrooms, check out their site, realmushrooms.com. And also listeners of this show, if you go to their site, realmushrooms.com/universe, you get 25% off your first order, which is a really good deal. And I think once you start working and tasting their products, you'll really see and feel a big difference. So thank you to them. And I think that's it. And without further ado, here is the intro to the show. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Christina Allen. Christina was recommended to me by another guest who I had on probably about a year ago, Joan Wilcox, who is very immersed in the Qero Andean tradition, and she very highly recommended Christina, so I was really happy to have Christina on. We had a really beautiful conversation. I think we went about 2.5 hours. We got into her history. She has a really interesting story. She grew up in Alaska and was quite connected to the nature there and the mountains, which turns out very much influenced her work, as she also became very familiar and engrossed in this same Qero lineage of the Peruvian Andes. Her time with the Grateful Dead and beginning to work with psychedelics, kind of her shamanic calling, I guess you could say, and how she was very influenced by certain trauma that she had in her life and how that influenced her work. It's also a big part of the work she does now. And just kind of the shamanic calling in general. So it was a really interesting conversation. I think she expresses herself really beautifully, and she has a really interesting story and seems to be doing really good work. So it was really a pleasure to sit down and speak with her. So I hope and trust you will all really enjoy this conversation with her. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good option. It's a subscription service. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As, If you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a really excellent way to give back and to help to support me, to bring on these really beautiful guests like Christina. To all the patrons, to all the people who have done that, as always, thank you very much for your support. There's also the option to direct donate via PayPal. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. If you're not able to do that, as always, just helping with the algorithms is a really big help too, to get this show out to a bigger audience. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, subscribing to the show, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving any questions or comments in the comment section, all those things really help to drive the algorithms. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review is also a really big help. So I think that's it. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Christina.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, great, Christina. Well, thank you very much for coming on. We were chatting a little before we started, and you were actually recommended to me by, I assume, a good friend of yours, a teacher of yours, and someone who I interviewed, who I really enjoyed that interview. And that's Joan Wilcox. And she wrote to me, and you're actually the only person she's ever reached out to me and recommended, so I felt like I should take her advice. And I watched a couple videos of yours, and I was really happy to have you on. So first of all, thank you for coming on. Thank you for taking the time. And maybe just to start, if you could say a little bit about yourself to some of the audience may have heard of you, but I'd imagine there's at least a number of people who haven't. So maybe you can just give the audience a little bit of background about yourself, your history, your story, and what brought you to do the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, Joan said beautiful things about you too, so I feel honored to be here. My story is a story that's sort of a parallel story, and eventually those two lines come together. I had early childhood trauma, never diagnosed, which sort of set me up for an uphill battle with my nervous system, and then with parents who didn't have any room for, the dysregulation and that kind of stuff. So a lot of struggle just in terms of my personal life in trying to figure out what was wrong and how to remedy it. And then it might be that that's what drove the second line, or it might be just a destiny thing, but always wanting to be a healer, be a shaman, that kind of thing. And I think some of the early influence in that was I was raised in Alaska. We moved up there when I was 4 years old, and you're just surrounded by these majestic mountains. I was living in Anchorage. There were Native Americans all over the place. And, in our assemblies, people have school assemblies, and in our assemblies, Native Americans were doing the raven dance, and they were stomping and playing their sealskin drums, and they had these long sealskin mitts that they had with little shells on them, and they would shake the shells, and they would wear raven masks, and I was just entranced with that whole thing. They would do these things called blanket tosses, which are essentially a trampoline, but it's everybody holding a big, huge skin that somebody jumps on and off. And the whole thing was magical to me. So the combination of just having that innate sense of saving all the little animals that my cat was mutilating, trying to just heal things, probably because of my own need to heal. And then this Native American thing in Alaska, I think it just set, early seeds for me. My parents split up when I was a teenager. My mom moved to California, very close to San Francisco, and that was in the 70s, and there was all the psychedelia of the, San Francisco. And I dove right in. I was a Grateful Dead fanatic. I did all kinds of psychedelics as a teenager, and I read all the Carlos Castaneda books back then. I think there were only 4 back then, and it just kept growing in me. Like this is what I want to do. I want to be a shaman, or I want to be a healer. I want to be in that space between the worlds, helping people hold, healing. And what I understand now, many, many, many years later, is that space between the world is a place that is very comfortable for someone who's had trauma, because they go into dissociation, especially if you've suffered freeze. And freeze is one of the 3 sort of major stress responses that we have in a nervous system. We have fight, we have flight. But if we do not have the capacity to run or to fight because we're in a power differential of some sort, either we depend on that person for economic survival, for love, or they're considerably bigger than us, or all of those, our body goes into a different mode. Instead of getting all jacked up, the parasympathetic nervous system taps in and shuts us down into a form of paralysis. And in paralysis, you survive. In freeze, you survive, but part of you dissociates. Your experience of yourself goes outside your feelings, outside your body presence, and you will develop that sense of consciousness of living between the worlds in a way. So I think on some level it's an initiation for people who are in the healing traditions. A lot of them have gone through some kind of trauma that they've had to live in that space. I didn't even understand that was what that space was for the longest time. But when I started doing psychedelics, I would go, oh, this is where I feel most comfortable. This is my sort of my default, my most actualized self is in this. I would obviously hit all the things you have to hit in a psychedelic session, but I would also feel this kind of really deep centering on who I was, which is actually really an important part of the Andean tradition, which I'll get back to later. But just to finish the story, I spent my adolescence doing a lot of psychedelics, doing a lot of Grateful Dead shows, which is interesting because on some level now in retrospect, I get that they're like an ayahuasca ceremony. Everybody there was on LSD or mushrooms, and there was music playing, and the whole group would turn into this group consciousness and go through a thing together, which was just fascinating to me. But I go to college. There's no major of shaman or healer or anything like that, and I was primed from my childhood and from my background to go to the university. And so I just kind of futzed around for a while, and finally I decided, well, the easiest thing to do, I'm saying, with a laugh, to kind of understand reality and the nature of reality, which is what I wanted to get to the bottom of, because I had this sense from psychedelics that everything is energetic and conscious at a fundamental level. How do I understand that? How do I study that? How do I work with that? In the Western world, the only answer really was to study physics. So I buckled down and got my degree in physics, and got my degree and I studied non-locality, which was this concept that there is action at a distance, that something happening, a molecule or an atom spinning over here can affect an atom spinning over here without there being any kind of conscious, physical connection between them, which told me, there's a consciousness in place that's informing those two atoms or particles. This comes from John Clauser's experiments on non-locality. We could talk about that if you want to. But generally, what I realized was there was an implicit consciousness already in place, because in physics, nothing can happen faster than the speed of light. And those two those two atoms were affecting each other, ions really, were affecting each other with faster than the speed of light could connect them through communication. So it implies that there's this implicit kind of alive consciousness. So I studied that, and it was like, that's what I needed out of physics. When I had to go and get a job in the world, I'm like, no, this isn't really what I do. I'm not an oscilloscope, computer, kind of person. And I wasn't brilliant enough to be a theorist. Those guys speak math fluently. I used math as a tool, but it's a whole different animal to see a theoretical physicist at task. So I kind of bumbled for a little while, worked, in some labs, and then went back to graduate school and studied. I wanted to study consciousness because I was like, that's what's in the middle. That's what's between any two things. That's what the fabric of reality is. That's what's in that energy, in that matrix of energy that all things are. And I was immediately reduced down to the materialism of science and told, no, we're not interested in consciousness here, but if you want to talk about neurons, we can talk about neurons. And so I studied synaptic transmission in the rat brain, the hippocampus, learning and memory. I did this really high-end research at the time where we would cut little brain slices, rat brain slices, stimulate them, in the hippocampus, and then, see how reliable they were. The implication was the reliability gave you some indication of a memory being, kind of locked in. There's a whole lot to that. But I did that for, I was in graduate school for about 5 years working on my PhD. And then, how the world is. My mother died, and I went into some place to follow her out. And I realized, consciousness isn't in these little neurons, because she's still talking to me, and she's paralyzed. She's in a coma. She is dying. She is dead, and we're still in conversation. And so as her body went offline and she still stayed online, I was like, okay, this is not Kansas anymore. There's something way more to consciousness than I'm ever going to find in the brain. So I started looking into spiritual traditions, how to find a way to talk about it. I'd been calling in a shamanic teacher since I was, a teenager, and as a white kid from the suburbs, white chick from the suburbs, I wasn't finding any way to do that in the 70s. And so I studied yoga. I got really involved in yoga, went to India, studied with, a teacher there. I started getting into the philosophies of other traditions that would talk about consciousness and talk about self-development. And then finally, in my 40s, by a weird kind of synchronicity or circumstance, something I didn't design, I ended up at a talk that was given by Alberto Villoldo, and he was talking about quantum mechanics and shamanism. And I went, oh yes, this fits. This is a teacher. This is a languaging I understand. And his main focus of tradition was the Andean tradition from the mountains of Peru. He mixed a lot of other things in with his perspective, but the Andean tradition was sort of the focal point of his teachings. So I studied with him. I went through his program, and then I started to finally heal from my trauma. And repressed memories popped, and I started to realize, this is why I was I was messed up. So a whole lot kind of shifted when I stepped into that domain. I learned how to heal. He taught a way of mixing the Andean tradition with Western concepts like psychology and techniques like breath work and tracking into the unconscious. And I did that work for a while, and I was with him for about 10 years. I went to Peru. I did a lot of work with the Pacos there. I didn't spend time talking to them because it was not really set up like that, but I did a lot of despachos with them, a lot of sitting with them, a lot of holding space with them. I traveled one-on-one with, and took a group with one of them to Choca Corral twice, 2 different times. So there was a lot of time with them, but there was a language barrier. So there was not this kind of deep, let's sit and talk about the philosophy, but they're not big talkers anyway. They're not really philosophical in that sense. They're very practical. So I finally left Alberto and started my own work in Texas. I started my own school. And it was a few years in that I had this contact. I took a class, an online class with Joan. And she was teaching the traditional tradition. And it was like, oh, I see all the things that were missing from my original training. There was no training in the actual medicine work. And there were also some other shamanic things that were brought in that sort of downgraded the brilliance and the elegance of the Andean tradition. So the main thing I would say that Alberto's version introduced, even though he addressed not being a victim, he also taught some of the victim perspective that comes from shamanic traditions, of being possessed, of being taken over by entities, of having attachments, of having curses, all these kinds of things. And as I got deeper into the traditional Andean work, I realized, I learned that that wasn't really the high-level Paco's perspective. Joan talks about the 3 levels, I mean, the multiple levels of conscious awareness. And at the 4th level, which is the level of the bridge level of the Paco, the level where somebody is able to move out of the conditioning of their mind and their teachings and their family and into that relationship with the mystical, and that bridging multiple traditions and being able to hold multiple truths at one time. From that perspective, there is no victimhood. From that perspective, you can take agency, and you are, the cultivator of your own garden. You can raise your energy levels to some high vibration where nothing can affect you. Nothing can enter your energy field. Nothing can penetrate your psychology, all that kinds of stuff, without your invitation. So it started a whole nother level of the way I held my clients, of the way I worked. I learned how to tune energy. One of the fascinating things about the Andean tradition is they tune with love. They tune the energy of creation, which is called Sami, to a higher frequency, which is called Munai. Munai is love. So you heal with love. It's just amazing. And then you can tune Munai to an even higher frequency called Hampe Munai, which is love with sort of like a little thunderbolt through it. It's the way I see it is it helps deconstruct and reconstruct energetic reality so that you can actually shift and move things at the energetic level and redesign them. So that's where I am now. I'm doing a lot of healing work. I help a lot of people heal from trauma. What I notice in trauma is they get frozen. And frozen is a thing that happens at a lot of levels. One, your body holds on to the story. You endured that event, and so your body sort of gets locked in that lattice of information. If we were a gazelle running from a lion, when the lion was gone, we would shake that all out, but we don't do that as humans. We just hold that. We just hold it in our bodies. When we are little kids, we go to our mom, usually, or our dad, but more often our mom, and we say something happened and we're crying, and mommy holds us. And we entrain to her healthy nervous system. And that's how we get that release, and that's how we readjust our energy system so it's not all chaotic and frazzled, but it's also healing with love. It's also intuitively knowing that Munai is what helps heal people from trauma. So that is the work that I'm doing with people, is helping them break down these things. So at the physical level, you get locked into a physical kind of lattice. At the mental emotional level, you get locked into personality structures that are dysfunctional, and you don't express the emotions that happened from that event. And then at the energetic level, you end up having an energy field that's discordant. It's got all kinds of frazzle in it, representative in a sense from the different personality structures we develop to get through trauma or through our traumatic event. So the Andean medicine is beautiful. It's absolutely stunning in that it takes us to this place of, we can reshape you, reformat you through this high level of love and help you melt that freeze. The body will start to tremble and shake out the trauma. And then there's some other, other parts that are interesting too, like soul retrieval. So all of that has been, what I've been doing for the last 40 years, last 20 years, really, I guess. Well, for my whole lifetime. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot there we could go into. You kind of mentioned in the beginning that in your childhood you experience, and it's a word that I think has become quite popular in more of our modern culture, but this idea of trauma. And even kind of how you were explaining trauma, that it's something that's kind of then imprinted in our energetic field. Do you find that that's something that's quite common with people who are somehow drawn to this work? Because you often hear in a lot of shamanic cultures that there's this idea of they wouldn't use the word trauma, but there's often some kind of cathartic experience or cathartic release or a big life change or a near-death experience, something that awakens people. Also, you said something that's really interesting, which I found to be true, which is this idea that when someone does experience a lot of trauma, and especially in childhood, that they do tend to disassociate, to go out of their body, and so it makes it in a way much easier to kind of be in that liminal or kind of almost like hypnagogic space, this space between the two worlds. And it's also a really interesting, I think, definition of shamanism that you used, which is like this ability to traverse both worlds, which I think is a really beautiful way of speaking of shamanism. But maybe this is a long-winded question, but can you speak a bit more, maybe from your experience, about kind of that idea of maybe that connection between this difficulty in childhood or kind of this cathartic experience that also seems to maybe awaken people to a shamanic world. You also mentioned something really interesting, which I found quite fascinating for myself, which was also this idea that I grew up in the U.S., but I was very interested in Native American cultures, and that very much, I think, sparked that urge as well. But I also remember I took a trip to Mongolia in my early 20s, and I think it was the first time where I was just in this pureness of nature. And Mongolia is very pure in that way. I mean, there's no roads, there's no telephone poles, there's no, there's these huge swaths of land with no towns, no people, no nothing. And I remember being in the mountains at one point, and I think it was maybe the first time in my life where I literally felt this sense of awe, this reverence of nature, and this humility, this feeling of smallness. And I was really able to see how these people who were really not connected to nature in some new agey sense, but just really in nature, how that reverence and the respect and the awe, the power of nature could really infuse into someone's vision, their cosmovision, how it could shape their world. And it also seems like something that we're very cut off from in our modern societies. Like most of us don't even see the stars anymore. It's, and that really affects our worldview. But again, this is kind of a long-winded question, but I guess speaking something about that idea of, because that's how you began your story, which was that as a child you experienced trauma, but that also somehow shaped you to also kind of find this shamanic path.
Yeah, that makes me think of a lot of things when you say that. In terms of trauma, here's an interesting story. I didn't know that I dissociated and that I had trauma until relatively recently, when I fell into a fire, and I landed with my hand on the burning embers, and I got out, and I was actually holding a despacho ceremony, and we were going to put this despacho in the fire, and I tripped and fell into the fire pit, and immediately got out. Apparently, I was engulfed in flames, and then it receded and came back, and I just stepped out of the fire, and I was initiated. It just came through me spontaneously. And what it did was it made me dissociate. It made me separate from my body. And I kept going in and out over a few months of being in my body and out of my body and in my body. And I was like, this is really hard, but it's also familiar, and I don't know what's going on, and I'm really struggling right now. And a friend of mine, who is a psychotherapist and who works with trauma and with the unconscious aspects of trauma, said, come see me. And so I went to go see her, and she showed me this whole, these stripes of color. And she said, look at the green color at the top. And then she said, look at the red color at the bottom. And when I looked at the red color at the bottom, I went into complete panic just looking at a red stripe. And I just went into complete panic. And she goes, look at the green one. And I looked at the green one, and I came back in, and I was okay, and everything's fine. I go, what happened? And she goes, you were traversing two realities. And I said, what? And she goes, in psychology, we would say it's dissociation. She goes, but in the spiritual traditions, you are going into another realm of reality and leaving this one. And I went, oh, this makes so much sense. I've been doing this all along. So it wasn't until, relatively recently, about 5 years ago, that I even recognized that it was dissociation. I just had trouble. It was more of a peril for me than it was anything, because anytime there was a stress, I would shut down. So taking an exam or having an authority challenge me, these kinds of things, I would just shut down or go into fight, and not be able to be a normal person and just have the discussion of, what's going on. So it was more of a struggle that I had to deal with, but I also it was very easy for me when I started to learn the shamanic traditions to go into it. It was like a fish in water. I'm like, oh, yeah, I know this. I know this space. I know this space of traveling in the unconscious. I know how to track people. I read people all the time. So there was a sense that it had and the way, as someone who studied neuroscience, what I think is that as you go through trauma, it resets your brain. I know that. It resets your brain. It resets your energetics. It resets your brain. What's interesting to me about, say, the Andean tradition is one of the ways that the Ultima Sioux, which are the high-level Pacos, one of the ways they get initiated is they get hit by lightning, and it rewires their brain. And we could say they dissociated. We could say all kinds of things. We could put it in magical terms, but they get rewired. And in their rewiring, they are able now to hear the mountains. They hear the apus. The apus are the mountains in Peru. Some of the mountains are apus. Some of the mountains are mountains. Apus are these wise beings that give guardianship, that give information, that give solace, that are just there for to refer to, and they help the Pacos with their work. I'll tell you a story in a minute about that. They help keep them alive and well. So this idea that you get rewired and you can hear the spirit beings, I think is core to the shamanic traditions. If you get really into very literal explanations about shamanism, that word comes from Siberia, and from one tribe in Siberia, and no one is a shaman except for those guys. There are people that get into, they have a certain kind of version of shamanism and nothing else is shamanism. But I think we have to use it as an umbrella term for all these indigenous kinds of ways of going into that other space. People would argue with me on that, but it's got to be called something, and it's definitely not psychology.
Yeah, so, sorry to interrupt you, but just an interesting side note on that. Because it's a common argument that you hear, but I think that argument very often also comes from people who are not familiar with this work too, or maybe more familiar with it on an intellectual level. But I think actually if you look at, it's very interesting because the word shaman in that Siberian tradition, it comes from sama, which they think means to know. And for example, I've spent a lot of time with a group of people called the Shipibo people, and their word for ayahuasca, which is one of their main teacher plants, is uni, which means to know. And so someone who works with uni is an onaya, which means one who knows. And I was just speaking to my girlfriend. We were mentioning I'm coming from Russia, which is an interesting story. But, she was telling me that the traditional name for the plant medicine people here, for a curandero, for a healer, actually has to do with knowledge. It's one who knows. So, I think it's very nitpicky when people say that, but the roots of these things, the words etymologically across cultures, across societies, actually all point to the same thing. So I think it's very useful, as you said, to use that word, and it's not out of disrespect to anyone at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think the people who get caught up in it are the people who have studied that tradition, and they see differences in the other traditions, and they get sort of what Joan would call, well, all of us in this tradition would call the third level, which is this is right and that's wrong. These are the rules. These are the details. I'm like, yeah, no. There are lots of ways to transcend this reality and to get into that other reality and do what the work is. So the other thing that was interesting to me about what you said about nature was in Alaska, I spent a lot of similar kinds of time. I ended up, just how synchronicities are, I put myself through college by working for my dad. My dad stayed in Alaska. My mom moved to California. My dad owned this company, created this company that served petroleum companies, in Alaska, looking for coal and gas and oil and all those kinds of things. So he would go up and create a little tent camp with generators and Quonset hut tents, and it was a little hotel. He'd drop in, big stove ranges and freezers and food. It would all be helicoptered in, and then you just have this summer camp for these guys, and they would helicopter out and take core samples, and various different things that they would do. And I was able to be one of the people that ran one of those camps for several summers. And so when the guys were out with their helicopter and they were all in their place, I'm in this camp all by myself in the middle of the Brooks Range, at the top of the Arctic Circle, at the foot of Denali, all these amazing places where there are no other people. And there is that sense of solitude and aloneness, but also that sense of connection with, you're part of this whole amazing thing, and you're a place where maybe no other human has ever been before. And there's this sense of, I'm thankful for all the things that we brought here so I can live, but I'm also, like you said, there's this awe of the interaction and connection. And up there, the northern lights, the aurora borealis would fill the skies. in the summertime, it was fascinating because the sun would just kind of pop down below the horizon and then come back up. So you had a little bit of dusk for a few hours. And in those few hours of dusk, the sky would just undulate with purple and pink and green. And it was amazingly awe-inspiring and magical. And it brought up in me all that kind of stuff of, this connection to earth and this connection to nature and this feeling held by nature. And I think that's another interesting thing about the shamanic, someone who's initiated, however you're initiated or called to shamanism, is often that trauma piece makes you distrust humans. So you tend to gravitate towards nature because it's safer. Pachamama is the big mama. She's the one you want to go to, or your biological mother might have been a little iffy. She might not have been able to entrain you to a normal nervous system. But Pachamama, she's got that steady rhythm, and she can bring you back home and bring you back to yourself. Another thing that's interesting about the Andean tradition that I think Joan mentioned is we all have within us this Inca seed. And this is part of the Andean cosmovision is within us, there is this spark of creation that each one of us has that's individual, and it is our full potential. It's also our inner compass, and it faces north. And what happens in trauma is that gets overridden by needing to control our life and our environment and trying to figure out who we are, creating dysfunctional personality constructs to ensure that you get by. That whole thing gets shut down. And one of the things I watch happen in people healing from trauma is when you can get them out of their intellect, out of their logical mind, and there are lots of different ways to do this. You can use breath work, you can use psychedelics, but when you can get into that altered state, they can get outside all the dysfunction that they think is their personality, that they think is who they are, that they identify with, and they can start to source from their Inca seed again. And I think that's where real healing happens, is where that internal part of you that knows who you are can start to come back online.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, specifically with trauma, because even recently in kind of this more modern psychedelic assisted therapy movement, there does seem to be a lot of very positive results with things like MDMA, with psilocybin, really helping people with trauma. And for a lot of psychology, that's quite rare. I mean, psychology didn't, and it's not to downplay or downgrade the validity of psychology, but kind of more modern medicines in that way really didn't have a very high success rate. Just kind of chronic ailments in general. But especially with the mind and things like trauma. And some of the preliminary research seems to be very positive with some of these substances being able to help trauma, specifically PTSD and in war veterans and things like that. But one of the interesting things I find with plant medicine in general is that it almost seems like one of the requisites for healing is that it does need to bypass the mind. Because the mind, in a way, if we were able to solve it at the level of the mind, then we would all be able to solve it. We could pick up a book and read A, B, and C, and our problems would all be gone. But it seems like not just for trauma, but just, or maybe using trauma in a bigger sense, which is maybe in a more indigenous way. They would say that the original trauma, maybe in a Buddhist sense, is just our very existence, this inherent suffering, or maybe in more indigenous philosophies, they would say that the nature of trauma is we've forgotten who we are and where we come from. Maybe in more religious traditions, this idea of like the fall from Eden, we've become separated from our true essence. But the plants actually, they tend to bypass the mind, and they take us, as you said, into this more somatic experience, this experience that's beyond the mind. even the mind that tries to rationalize or justify the experience, at some point it tends to break down. So do you think that's part of the role of plants, maybe just in general? Because, as you said, it does seem like they're very successful with trauma in that way, and very much in the way you said, is somehow getting people out of their minds. And also in the cultures that we come from, we do tend to be quite mind-oriented. And again, not in a bad way. There's medicine in all of our ways of being, but often in these kind of more quote-unquote Western societies, we are very mind-based, and a lot of these plants or techniques, even as you mentioned, like a lot of the Pacos or the Qeros, these Andean traditions, they tend not to speak a lot, as you said. They're not kind of catering to this medicine of the mind. It's something much more somatic, something much more felt, more heart-centered.
Yeah, from what I, from personal experience, from working with clients for 20 years, the mind is actually what creates the dysfunction on some level. The mind locks into a way to protect ourselves from that happening again. And so it creates its own sort of moat around ourselves, and it insists on being the interface with the world. You could put it in psychological terms. It creates personas that it insists on, you have to talk to the hand, you have to talk to this part of who I am. And this part of who I am is often running a dysfunctional program. For example, if you have had freeze, a sort of a secondary or corollary to freeze is the fawner, the people pleaser. It's a way to avoid not just trauma, but freezing again, because in freeze you lose control. So you don't want to lose control. So the way you have control is by consciously giving away control. It's a very interesting thing that we do, but it's not functional. It's not a good long-term plan. It might get you through your childhood. It might get you through some part of your life, but that's the thing that the plants do, is they take you past that part of yourself and connect you, one, with a universal safe thing that's always there, both the sky god, if you want to call it, the matrix, the earth, these things that are perpetual and always there, more trustworthy in a sense than our adults that were in our lives. A lot of people who have freeze, came at the hands of their parents or the adults that were supposed to keep them safe. So there is this real sense of no safety, this sense of creating a mind structure, personality structures to keep us safe, but those personality structures keep us actually in dysfunction. So the plants are beautiful in that they come through and they say, okay, let's break past the mind and allow you to connect, one, with the universal energy that you've shut out in trying to keep yourself safe and trying to solve it all and control it all, and two, let's get you back in touch with your Inca seed, with your core self, with who you are, and let's make that a direct connection. Let's make it so that you are now speaking to the universe instead of trapped in your mind. And the Andeans would not speak of it this way, this literal way, but you see it in their medicine, because they speak of having a pokpo, an energy field that is reflective of our internal state. So if we are in chaos because we have a personality structure that's driving an agenda to keep safe, but keeps throwing us under the bus, we have this discordant energy, and our energy field is discordant. And part of what the Andean tradition is, they don't say let's talk about your problems. They say bring energy through and restructure your energy field, bring it back into accord, bring it back into coherence, and that will feed into your personality, your mind, that will feed into your body. They see it from that source in. So I forgot where we started, but I think that's some interesting stuff to throw out there about healing and energy work and the plants. Oh, we started with the plants. Yeah, so the plants, I think, what's interesting to me is how the plants in the Andean tradition complement each other, because the plants are going here, remember the whole construct. And in the West, we need that reminder. Interestingly, in the Andean perspective, they don't use the plants that are down in the jungles. All they have up there is coca. That's the only plant they have. And coca just makes them feel more euphoric. It gets more blood through their system for that high altitude. But it's lots of rocks, lots of sky, condors. It's not a lot of jungle animals. So their whole perspective isn't scary and something's hiding in the dark. It's wide open skies, and that's what we've got to use to heal with, is the energy of creation. So it's a very interesting thing, because we need the jungle and we need the plants almost, because we can't remember that the sky's out there. We're caught with all the animals and all the internal alligators. And we are needing to remember, like, to open up and remember both that open sky and that full potential that we have. The Andeans just use energy to try and transmute that. In the jungles, we use plants. But I think in the West, both are really important. And here's the thing about psychology and psychedelic therapy. I think you're right. I think they are finding a new way to get through to people. And it's a precipice for psychology, because psychology has tried to align with science and be very logical and linear and research-based. And what psychedelics are asking psychology to do is to open up into this field of the spiritual realms, of there is more than your mind. With the psychological tools that we've had so far, it's always been treat the brain, because the brain creates your reality. And with the psychedelics, it's saying, actually, let's just shut the brain down for a little bit. It is the brain that we're working with on some level with psychedelics, but it's the default mode network is a part of your brain that is a big filter. And what psychedelics do is they shut that filter down so that we can start to remember what's out there and we can start to connect again. And I think psychology is going to be really, really kind of forced to step into the spiritual realm to take ownership of how this healing is happening with psychedelics.
You're in an interesting position in that you were saying you were a deadhead, and you spent a lot of time kind of in that scene, in that culture, especially in the 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of that kind of psychedelic movement was really emerging, especially in the U.S. And then for various reasons, it really stopped. It came to a halt for a number of decades. And then kind of in the last decade, it's really begun to reemerge again, and especially in the last few years at a very, very fast rate. Can you speak maybe a little bit about like what you see kind of in that transition period of kind of this emergence of this psychedelic culture to again a complete halt, and then what you see coming out again? Because it seems like there are similarities, but there's a very different feel to it as well. I mean, it seems, for example, like we were talking about, it's become much more mainstream, and it seems like it's also moving in a different way, but also maybe subject to some of the same things as before as well. But you seem like a perfect person to be able to speak about that.
It's an interesting phenomena. I think the government is what shut it down, right? This whole war on drugs, this feeling like people were getting a little too alive and well and conscious, I think. When the 60s and 70s happened, there was a huge cultural explosion and change. The birth control pill came out, sexuality came out, all kinds of things. Women's rights started to become important. There was a huge cultural shift, and at some point it all kind of, and the Vietnam War was going on, and there was all kinds of protests about that, and these things all seemed to be linked. And for whatever reason, I think our government decided that it was getting a little too chaotic and a little too hard to control, and they shut it down, under the guise of a war on drugs. There are drugs that aren't good for us, for sure, but not psychedelics. For some reason, the psychedelics got put in the same class as, heroin and fentanyl and all those kinds of, they're all Schedule I drugs. And they very much should not be. They're helper plants. There are helper plants out there. And it's very small doses. Opium is a good thing. It can take away pain. There's also this human thing of we want to, we want to distill the active ingredient and use it, That's a whole nother thing, that we distill the active ingredient, like we take cocaine out of coca, and we take opium we take opium out of the poppies and we make fentanyl or what. And in its natural form, in its plant form, there's a consciousness there that is trying to engage the people. There's this great relationship between humans and plants. And humans are weird. They just get greedy. They get addictive. They want these things. So I get a little bit the war on drugs, but I think mostly it was a political thing, and it definitely didn't have anything to do with psychedelics. They got put in the wrong class. But I think that there's a political reason for that, because they were raising the consciousness of humanity. And so if you kind of look at, you can put your foot down on a tiger, but eventually that tiger is going to rise. That consciousness, that forefront of humanity, of cultural, of the human consciousness is pushing forward. And these plants and these substances are coming back in and saying, we're not going to be shut down again. This is an important part of your evolution, but we're going to come in from the side door. The thing that's interesting to me about the side door that it's coming through is the side door of veterans who need to heal from PTSD. This is the pivotal place that's making this more mainstream. I mean, there are all kinds of circles and all kinds of other things. There's a lot of spiritual revolution that's happening as well. But I find the connection between, especially like MDMA and psilocybin and veterans, and seeing veterans heal from their PTSD. They have seen horrible, horrible things, and nothing. You can't just medicate them and hope they'll be okay. They need to change. They need to transcend that mindset that's holding them, and work through the stuff that they don't want to face. On these medicines, working with these medicines, we have essentially the help, the alliance, the support of these plants to go and face these things. I mean, you can talk about it neurologically, that the amygdala gets softened, that we're not so afraid to see with these things. But you can also look at it from a spiritual perspective, and now we have support. Now there's something more than just us versus the world. Now we can go into these things and start to look at them and start to heal. So I think this is just one of those big beasts that is part of humanity. It's always been part of humanity, and that we tried to shut it down for a while was sort of short-sighted. Anything that you try and repress is going to come out louder than it was before. And I don't know that you can put this one back in the box. It's just become so big and so mainstream. But the thing that worries me is that psychology is going to take these beautiful medicines and make them all about the brain again, or science is going to do that. And you're like, you're missing a whole level of awareness, a whole bandwidth of connection that is out there, of information, of wisdom, of guidance, that is lost when you keep reducing it into this materialistic, proven, this molecule will do that to that molecule. This molecule will excite or dampen these neurons and make them put these neurotransmitters out into the. Yes, that happens, but that's sort of the interface That's the workings of the car. It's not the driver of the car.
You mentioned Carlos Castaneda, who I think is a fascinating kind of figure. He like yourself and also like me, I mean, those books that he wrote really seemed to spark a lot of people's interest in this field, and an interest that maybe really was very small or not there at all. And I know kind of in more recent times he's been criticized, maybe the validity of his work or the timeline of it. But the more I've done this work, and when I think about what I read and what he wrote about, especially at a time when there was very little information about these practices, I mean, it seems to me he must have been writing from a place of direct experience, the validity of whether he actually did these things, and the timelines may be in question, but he really did seem to be at least speaking from some place of truth. Is that something like that you've thought about, or that his work had an influence on your work, or really sparked a curiosity, or kind of gave you an impetus to really, I don't know, see things in a different way, or eventually, search out for these Pacos or these Qeros who maybe through Castaneda, like something awakened in you that really made you think about things in a different way?
Yeah, absolutely. I was like 15, 16, 17 in high school, doing a lot of psychedelics, going to a lot of Grateful Dead shows, and reading Carlos Castaneda. And so there was this whole thing that just popped open in me, which was kind of getting that there was a spiritual or energetic realm. And when I say energetic, I mean a conscious energetic realm. In our Western tradition, we seem to only go as far as the mind. Everything is a product of the mind. But what happens when you go on psychedelics, what happens is you open into this space of realizing the connectivity between everything. And so I was having the visceral experience through psychedelics of that happening. I was going to Grateful Dead shows and having a group experience of that happening. And then I was reading these Carlos Castaneda books where he was talking about sort of those states of consciousness to heal and to heal people. And I, at the time, I just thought it was all true and all, I didn't question it. And then, as you say, as you go further in, you realize he was actually an anthropologist. He was writing about, things that he found in Mexico on his journeys there. But I think when you start to go into that space where everything is connected, and you start to study a medicine and it starts to come through you. I know that happens to me with the Andean stuff. I don't know how some white girl from Alaska and California and now Texas ever got to be someone who speaks with authority about the Andean tradition, but I started studying it and it started to come through me. And I think that that's probably what happened to him too. I think it's what happens to you on this journey is that information's already stored there in the collective. And once you open the doors to it, you're privy to it. You can connect to it and you can work with it. And you can, even though you weren't raised in that tradition, that information is accessible. And I that's how I hold it, what he did. I thought he brought through another layer of understanding of human consciousness that was missing, but really compatible with the psychedelic movement that was happening at that time. And it's a thing that there's a concept in a lot of indigenous traditions called soul retrieval, and it seems like every time we say it's only the mind, it's only the brain, we have soul loss. Literally, we've lost the soul because that doesn't exist. It's all the brain. but we lose that connection to that higher consciousness. And we keep having these soul retrievals when we bring back the psychedelics. We keep remembering, oh, there's this other level of ourselves. There's the soul level. There's the connection to source. There is the source. And then the mind level, the control level, whatever that is, no, we got to shut that down and we have to put it in a box. But that has to be expressed. And I think that's part of our human evolution. And that's one of the things that the Andean tradition actually just has implicit in it, is these 7 steps of developing human consciousness, where we become more and more aware of our connection to the source energy. And there are 7 steps up, and the very 7th level is what is called Taitanchis Ranti. And Taitanchis is God, and Ranti means same or similar. So the 7th step is we are the same as God. That's when we have got to the very highest level of consciousness that a human can contain, or can express or can imbue. So it's always there. It's always trying to come through. It gets tamped down by the 3rd level, by the people that want to be in control, the people that have, various fears. Oh, there's a lot of things that shut it down. But I think when you start to get up to those higher levels, you connect into the human consciousness that has always ever been there, and you start to be able to pull that stuff through.
Could you speak a bit more about your work with physics? I find that fascinating, and it's an interesting thing, because I'm also very fascinated by physics, and yet at the same time, often in this work, you get people who kind of pull these very specific ideas from physics, but kind of use them in all sorts of ways to also suit their own narratives. But that phenomena, I think, of non-locality is really fascinating. And I think something that for most of us, we don't really maybe think about or ponder what that really means. This idea that when something is affected in one place at seemingly impossible distances, something can be affected at the same time, kind of bypassing this idea of all matter moving at potentially the speed of light, but that something is even going beyond that. And also that idea of implicit consciousness, because so much of this work, if you boil it down, it is getting to this idea of what it means to be conscious, of again, who we are, where we come from. These are very indigenous ideas. It's not something that's even new or modern. This is the root of what it means to be a human being. And so many of these practices do seem to be asking us to really to face that in a way, to face who we are, to face this idea of what does it mean not only to be human, but, as you said, we all have this Inca seed. What does it mean to be me? Like, who am I? Am I my past? Am I my traumas? Am I my conditionings? Am I my thoughts, my fears, my beliefs? Or is there something beyond that? And often these practices, whether it's through a gentle way or a not so gentle way, bring us into a confrontation with that. So, but yeah, I find that work and especially that idea that you studied physics to be very fascinating. So maybe if you could speak a bit more about kind of your work or that idea of implicit consciousness, and maybe how that relates to what you've discovered in kind of this more, for lack of better words, as we said, this kind of shamanic nature of the work you do.
Yeah, I would love to. First of all, I studied physics a long time ago in the 80s. So it's not been something I've been keeping on top of as I moved into other things. But I did take away some core things. Back in the 80s, John Clauser was a physicist who had done some experiments in 1972. And he was the, sort of the big experimenter that talked about non-locality. Since then, they're now calling it entanglement theory. And I haven't followed all the details on entanglement theory, but I know it's rooted in non-locality. But I'll tell you the experiment that it's really simple to explain, that just says it all. You take a calcium ion and you energize it so it becomes unstable. And so it's going to break apart. And eventually it breaks apart into 2 cadmium ions. And because this original thing was stable in the sense that before you energized it, it wasn't, in any kind of level of instability, it means that its angular momentum was 0. But when these 2 break off, each one is spinning, and one's spinning clockwise, we could say, and one's spinning counterclockwise. They have equal and opposite angular momentum. So let's say +1 and -1 add up to 0, add up to the 0 that they came from. Does that make sense? So they're going at equal and opposite angular momentums, and you can do experiments where you can isolate one of those, and you can send it through long lines of polarizers back and forth, and you can change the polarity of its spin. So it too, so let's say you take the counterclockwise one, you can change it so it's now going clockwise, just like the other one. And if you put long enough lengths in your experiment, you're running this thing back and forth through long enough lengths, it will be enough distance to where you could measure what would happen in the speed of light. It's hard to measure what will happen at the speed of light like this, but if you can start to separate things out, you can say, oh, this is how much time it would take for this cadmium ion to talk to this cadmium ion. So they change the polarity of this cadmium ion, and immediately, faster than the speed of light, this one changes to counterclockwise so that they can stay equal and opposite, which tells us that something's happening faster than the speed of light, and nothing in physics can happen faster than the speed of light. That's the constant of the universe, is the speed of light. It's nothing can communicate faster than the speed of light. So if these 2 are communicating with each other somehow, in sync with each other, adjusting to each other's spin faster than the speed of light, it implies many things. It can imply there's no space. It can imply there's no time. But it can also imply that there's a consciousness that's already implicit between them. So they already know what's going on. And I go with that version. And that is the version that you'll find in shamanism, is everything is conscious, everything is connected through consciousness. In the Andean tradition, what they say is there's an immaterial universe created out of an energy called calci. And calci is a conscious, living energy. And absolutely everything is created out of calci. Everything is conscious, everything is living, everything is connected. If you take those 2 molecules, if you come back to the Clauser experiment, if you take those 2 molecules and you think about the Big Bang theory, all those pieces of matter that were stuck together in the very beginning, blown apart, all matter is still in conversation with itself, and it's probably even bigger than that. But what I love about the Kalsai-Pacha version, what I love about the Andean tradition, is they're saying the same thing. They're saying there's this fabric of consciousness that everything comes from, and we're all an expression of it. And not only that when we are conceived, when the egg and the sperm come together, a drop of that calci comes and drops down into that 2-egg organism, and that's our Inca seed. And it's individual. The Kalsai-Pacha is expressing 1,000,000 permutations of creativity. It's the creative force. It's creating duck-billed platypuses. It's creating humans. It's creating spiders and scorpions. It's creating rocks and bananas. It's creating everything. And in that 2-celled organism that our parents created with their egg and their sperm, bink, it's creating again, and it's creating a new thing. It's creating a Christina, and it's creating a Jason. And these are going to be expressions of the calcite pacha, but connected still to the calcite pacha, still part of that field of consciousness that we all came from. And then, of course, that's creation. So, the healing is engaging with the calcite pacha, right? It's engaging with the Inca seed, which is individualized. It's engaging with the human body, which has sort of torqued itself into some kind of structure because of experience that we have on the planet. Same with our energy field. And there's this thing of healing is restructuring ourselves, restructuring our conscious living energy to be more functional. And to me, that is the core of the Andean tradition of shamanism. It's the core of a lot of the traditions. They just talk about it differently. I had this interesting moment on my walk. I take these walks every morning with my dog, and I had this interesting moment. I spent a fair amount of time in the jungles of Peru as well, not just the mountains, and did ayahuasca down there with the indigenous ayahuasqueros. And so she started talking to me, long-term ayahuasca, that voice of the mother started talking to me. And I was walking in the forest here many, many years after all the jungle experience. And I was steeped in the tradition of the Andes. And she popped through and she said, you're doing the same thing in both traditions. And I go, what are you talking about? And she said, in the Andean tradition, you pull up this big force of energy from the earth, and you source from it, and you heal with it, and you hold people in that space with it. She goes, you are in the Andean tradition pulling it up through your intention. She goes, but in the tradition, in the Shipibo, I don't know the Shipibo tradition really, but she said in the I'm doing the same thing, is what she said. I'm pulling up that energy of Pachamama, and I'm running it through somebody, and I'm helping reinform them, and I'm helping rearrange them, and the ayahuasquero is helping me hold that space for them so that they can have the same thing. She goes, it's the same medicine. It's we're just doing it in different ways. She goes, you're pulling up that energy as the Paco, I'm pulling up that energy as the plant. And went, wow, that's fascinating.
So you came to, it sounds like one of the first paths you came upon in kind of this more traditional indigenous and especially Andean way of working was through Alberto Villoldo, who probably a lot of the audience is familiar with, because he's quite well known. He's written a number of books. Could you speak about a bit about what that experience was for you, like what you found from that, what some of the significant teachings were, and also kind of how that influenced you or what you learned from that?
Yeah, for me it was a wellspring. It was a life. It was a life jacket. I was drowning. I was at a place in my life where the trauma was just building to such a degree that I felt like I was just really struggling. I had a lot of problems with depression. And so I sort of limped into his first class going, one, I want to learn shamanism, but I know I have to heal before I can help anybody else. And I remember writing them a letter and saying, I would really like to take your classes, but I'm a mess. And they said, come, because as you unravel yourself, you will become a better healer. And part of his perspective, he does a lot of archetypal kind of things. He interfaces his teachings with a lot of Western perspective. And one of their archetypes was the wounded healer. And so I learned his tradition, and he was working. He sort of put a lot of things together. He was an anthropologist, a medical anthropologist. He studied a lot of different traditions and ended up in the Andes. One of the things that he said in his journey with studying different traditions, different shamanic traditions, was that the Andean tradition was the most pure. It hadn't been adulterated with religion and with alcoholism. And so that was the one he leaned into the most and was most informed by. But in hindsight, I can see that he was also informed by some of the other traditions that are more jungle-like, more, worrying about entities, worrying about energies coming and attacking you. And so I learned his version of shamanism. He, in a sense, he was kind of like Michael Harner. He put together a lot of different things and made it something that was accessible to the Western mind. And I think it's a great entry point. I am completely in gratitude for the years I spent there. And I learned how to teach. I learned how to hold that space for others to heal. And I think the thing that I learned the most in my time with Alberto, besides having this connection with the Qero, because I went to Peru with him several times, and it just changed my life to go up into those mountains and do ceremony with the Pacos over and over again. But the main thing I learned in terms of being a healer was how to hold this space of the unconscious and how to get into the unconscious and how the underpinnings of what is making us ill or what is keeping us stuck in trauma and dysfunction is unconscious. And like we were talking about before, you're not going to get there with the mind. And so he brought in breath work, and he didn't actually really fully embrace the energy medicine itself of the Andes. He didn't teach all the different ways of tuning the energy and things like that. But he did bring in the idea that you are healing with energy. And I think, the thing that I got, like I said, the thing I got from it the most was, one, how to track into the unconscious and how to hold that space for somebody to heal. I think we tend to want to fix somebody, especially in psychology. Even as a shaman, you can want to go like, what's wrong with this person? Just all you got to do is, just change this, you'll be fine. Just let me just fix you. And healing comes from this place, and I learned this from my work with Alberto, of opening up sort of like this cave, this space of undifferentiated energy, right? The void, this place where you can deconstruct yourself to reconstruct yourself. And you cannot do that from the mind. The mind's very controlling. It's filled with ideas. It's filled with, this is who I am and this is what I am, and I got to watch out for that guy and watch out for this guy. And if you can feel safe enough to go into this space, a couple things happen. The first thing that happens is all that unconscious stuff that needs to heal starts to surface, and you have to deal with it. You have to work through the emotions. You have to work through the somatic, how you're carrying it somatically. You have to purge. It's a lot like a psychedelic experience or a plant medicine experience, especially Aya. You have to purge for a while all the stuff that starts to come through. But then it evolves into this space, if you can just hold that space as a healer, for that person to reorganize themselves into who their better version of themselves is. So there's this real sense of, we're not going to fix this from the mind. And I think that was the brilliance that he brought to our culture, because he came through sort of I think his Shaman Healer Sage came out in the 90s, early 90s, maybe late 90s. And it was revolutionary in the sense that he was saying, he was taking psychology, because he understood psychology. I think his undergrad was in psychology, and he was moving it forward into saying, and there's another place to go with this. Healing's not reorganizing the way you think. Healing's reorganizing the way you perceive. And the way you perceive is changed by having a different experience of yourself. And so for that, I'm really grateful. I think that, his teachings on that level were really exceptional and brilliant. And I think I did need to go to the next level of learning the tradition, because the energy medicine and the instruction about the levels of consciousness and the Inca seed are all really important aspects that were not part of my learning with him, that I needed to also learn. And I also needed to unlearn that I was going to be attacked by some kind of energetic something or other, and I had to protect myself from that. In the Andean tradition, you raise your vibration. You have healing techniques. You have regular practices, and you just raise your vibration, and nothing penetrates your energy field. It's yours. The only way anything would penetrate your energy field is if you invited it in. So there's this real accountability in the tradition that wasn't in his version, and there's this sense of power that you have because you're not, subjected to all the scary, entities out there that are going to attack you. You have tools. You know what to do if you feel scared. You can clean and clear and raise your energetic vibration by pulling down the calci, by using the calci to your advantage. So there's another level that I needed to go to continue this work.
Could you speak a little more about that? Because it's, as you said, it's a very common ideology, worldview, and in a lot of shamanic traditions, which is this idea that you spoke about bad energies coming in, and maybe Amazonian cosmovision, this idea of brujeria, of witchcraft, but you find it in religious traditions, you find it in pagan traditions, and even I would say in our modern worldview too. We speak about trauma, for example, and this idea that someone did something to me and that's affecting me and I can't heal from it because that energy is still there. It's still penetrating me. Even though it's maybe over, it's still present with me, and it's like it's attacking me all the time, and I don't have the tools to, as you said, to protect myself, to raise that vibrational level in order to protect myself. So I think it's a very common way of looking at things. What from your experience with the Pacos and the Qeros were maybe one, their worldview around that, as to like what is the nature, the reality of those negative energies, and maybe if there's any techniques you can share that they shared with you, which is how to, because it's also very interesting what you said. A big part of healing is perception. And I think that's a vital point. So much of our pain and suffering comes actually from our perception, how we see the world. So maybe techniques or tools or even just world visions of how they relayed that to you to kind of bring that into order, into balance, into harmony.
Yeah, let me start with the Andean perspective. I think every environment shapes the way a culture develops. And the Qero are up in these mountains, 17,000 feet, 14,000 feet, way, way up in the sky. And it's cold, and there's not a lot. And they terrace, as you've seen the pictures, their agricultural program is to put rocks around the mountains so the dirt doesn't fall away. And then they plant in those terraces. They walk llamas and alpacas. They're very, very connected to the earth, very connected to the open sky, but most importantly, they depend on each other. They have to be collective. They have to be a community to survive the cold weather, to survive the food ration, the limits on food. So at the core of their worldview is this concept of munai, of love, of being, coming from munai. And I watched a talk recently by a translator, one of the Qero translators, and he said, I'm speaking to you in English right now, but when you speak in Quechua, which is the language of the Qero, English is a language of the mind, and we're having a conversation mind to mind. He goes, but when you speak in Quechua, you're speaking heart to heart. He said, even when you don't like somebody, they're still your brother. You're like, brother, I don't like you. There's this sense of there's always this community, always this sense of connection. And so you need each other, so you're not sending magic darts at each other. You're not undermining each other. You're not putting curses on each other. So all that kind of stuff is not even part of really of the mindset, at least as I've learned it through Juan and Yvonne Nunes de Prado. Juan spent a lot of time with the Qero and with three main teachers of the Andean tradition, and they essentially what they taught him was the darkness that you're perceiving is what you are creating in response to the external world. So you can slow your Sami down. Sami is Kausai in the created world. So Kausai is the immaterial world, and then in the created world, a subset of the Kausai is called Sami. It's a very refined form of Kausai that's used for creation. All of us are made of Sami. Everything we have is made of conscious living energy called Sami. Humans have the unique capacity to slow their Sami down because they're in conflict with each other. Because they're like, I'm strong, I can do this. Oh, I'm scared. At the same time, they're always sort of presenting a persona, but also not really expressing their Inca seed. And so, whenever we're out of alignment with ourselves, whenever we feel, threatened, whenever something is gnawing at us, we'll slow our Sami down, and it becomes what we call hucha. And hucha is not considered negative. It's not considered evil. It's just slow Sami. So it's on a spectrum. This is where I come back to physics. It's interesting to me. Like if you think of a light spectrum, there's red light and there's purple light. They're just different frequencies. We can slow our high vibrational Sami down to a low vibrational Sami. So the idea about external things being scary and making, attaching to you is conceivably a perceptual issue. Our reaction to something being out there that we feel threatened by can slow our Sami down to where it feels heavy. And we will say that thing is attaching to us, making us heavy. But in a sense, we've slowed ourselves down. It's our own hucha, our own slow Sami that we're reacting to, not an external force. And so what the Andeans would say is any of that stuff, even no matter what it is, it's Sami. It's created out of Sami. Only humans have hucha. So it's not going to get into your field. Your field is sovereign. Nothing can get into your energy field, your pokpo, without invitation in the Andean tradition. It's absolutely, it's not like a impermeable fortress. It's permeable. Sami comes and goes all the time. And so there's this sense of when you go into fear, you create sort of a rim of hucha that makes you more separate. So you start to be less connected and less engaging, less in aini, in reciprocity with the outside world. So this, the idea of there being external forces, there being ghosts, there being these things, what the Andean tradition would say is maybe they are, maybe they aren't, doesn't matter. It can't enter your field. If you're feeling something about it, just pull more Sami from the Kausai Pacha over your energy field and bring it back up. Or bring some Sami up from the earth and feel supported by her if you feel scared. There are tools, and I can tell you how to do each of these things. It's very simple. To keep you in that sovereign place so that even if there is stuff out there, and that's debatable, we can have all kinds of, who knows, right? But in the tradition itself, it would say it's not, you don't have to, it's not going to penetrate you unless you invite it in. Like I hear people say, I'm carrying my ancestors, I'm carrying the trauma, all these kinds of things. And what I say to them and what the Andeans would say is, you don't have to carry it. It's a choice. This is what I love about this tradition. It's always a choice. There is no victimhood here. You can say, that's actually not mine to carry. I'm going to put it back outside my bubble and let whoever it is work with it on their own. My mom will probably grow by working her own stuff instead of me carrying her. Ancestral stuff, the buck stops here. I'm going to make changes in the way that I do things from a conscious place. I have choice. I can choose not to continue to molest or not to continue to abuse. I can make those choices. So it comes from this place of raising your consciousness so you can see what the things are to choose and to not choose. And then just running Sami to keep yourself clean and clear, to raise your vibration when you drop into creating hucha more than anything, more so than something attached to you and I got to clean it off. It's more like I'm reacting to something outside myself that's making me feel small or insecure. So I need to boost my Sami back up because I lowered it, because I went into this fear place. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm sure it makes sense, but yeah, questions?
You said that when you first encountered the Qeros, you were doing a lot of, or you did a number of ceremonies when you came to them, to Peru. What was that like? Because I would imagine many people listening to this are probably more familiar with like plant medicine ceremonies, like doing ayahuasca in the jungle, or working with wachuma, San Pedro, or mushrooms. But as you said, often these ceremonies in the Andes with the Qero, with the Pacos, they don't necessarily involve very strong plants. And I mean, I remember even when I came to the Andes, I had been almost a decade, I think, in the Amazon. And when I first came to these mountains, it was almost like I had vertigo all the time because I was so used to this kind of contained, kind of claustrophobic, very womb-like, and I found very comforting kind of atmosphere of the jungle. I mean, to me, it was beautiful. But when I first came to the mountains, it was like, stepping into a new world. And it was just, I mean, I was almost like out of my body for months because it was just such an expanse. And even in the beginning, I was thinking, it seems kind of limiting. They're not working with plants. But then you go up to these apus and you're at, 4,500 meters. And there's a real power there that's very tangible. This silence, this feeling of being very small, of in the hands of God, in the cradle of God. This also very visceral force of like at any moment the environment could change to my detriment. And I think it commands a certain respect, much like plants. They very much command a respect. Even though in general the setting you're doing it in is quite safe, but when you're up in those mountains, much the same. Like it commands a certain respect. I mean, you do need to pay respect, or the nature can dispatch of you very quickly. But what were those ceremonies like for you? Because I think that's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, is this lineage of the Qeros, the Pacos, a lot of these Andean traditions. As you said, they may be working, for example, like with coca, but for people who aren't familiar, coca it's a very mild plant in general, and how it's dosed and how it's worked with. It's kind of like drinking tea or coffee in terms of its effect. But what were those ceremonies like for you, and what did you learn or take from those?
Interesting question. Yeah, I think in our Western culture, it's a little bit hard to get there in the beginning. I think in the beginning I was like, what they are, that we would do despacho ceremonies over and over and over and over again. We would go from one place to another place to another place and do despacho ceremonies. And in the beginning, I didn't quite get it. I'm like, all right, we're going to sit in a circle and this guy's going to blow into some leaves and we're going to put a bunch of stuff in this piece of paper. And, okay, that was fun. And then he's going to, wipe it over you and it's going to be put in the fire. all right. But the more I started to engage the medicine, and the more I started to understand the medicine, what I realized is they are engaging the Kalsaipacha. They're engaging the spirit beings. So you sit down with them, and they take a couple of three coca leaves, and they call in all the spirit beings, all the apus, all the mountains. They call in the nustas, the waters. They call in all the male and female energies. They call in their own, they call in the condor. They call in all kinds of different things that are a part of their environment that are considered spirit beings. And they're opening up this space, in a sense, that when we're in our minds, we don't conceive. You know, it's like we were talking about in our Western culture, like, yeah, whatever, okay, so he blew some stuff into a leaf, or very literal, he blew some stuff into some leaves, and he said some names, and okay, what, and now he's going to put it in that piece of paper. But when you start to develop the consciousness, the perception of energy, which is part of their tradition, you start to realize, oh, he just opened the bandwidth of energy information, of frequency, of connection to the spirit realm, and he's calling it in, and he's bringing it into this little piece of paper, and he's putting our prayers in there, and he's asking this whole universe to support our little prayers. And then we put it in the fire, and it goes back out into the universe. It's this sort of reciprocity that is part of their tradition that's called Aini. And so I think in the beginning, it seems like a strange ritual, and you're like, okay, that's nice. It isn't dynamic like energy plant medicine. But if you study the tradition, you start to become more and more aware as you go up to what's called the Kanchis Patanyan, these 7 levels of consciousness, and you start to be able to engage and see and perceive that there's another realm beyond the mind, and that realm is starting to join you, and that realm is starting to support you, and you're starting to be part of engagement with this realm. And that is the beauty of this tradition, is it takes us beyond the Western mind back into connection with the spiritual, with the metaphysical, whatever you want to call it, with the Kalsaipacha. It takes us out of that little sense of self of the human. And like you said, the sky is that place of expansiveness, and that's what they're asking you to do with your consciousness, is by perceiving and by working your hucha, by keeping your sami levels high, by keeping your vibration high and facing your fears and facing your internal stuff, you become clearer and clearer and more congruent with the energy of creation. You become part of that system. There becomes less difference between you and it. We're not in our own little mind so much. We're part of this whole expansive matrix that John, Clauser was talking about in terms of non-locality. We're part of this whole thing that we engage with. So it took me a while to really be able to see the value in it. But one of the parts of their tradition one of the things that they do traditionally is they do a lot of weavings. And what the despacho is, in a very real sense, is it's a weaving of all the energetic spirit beings with the human that's there, and their needs and wants and desires, and this intention, and they're creating this thing, this beautiful prayer bundle to put out into the world, to inform the world, because intention informs the world. Energy follows intention in the Andean tradition. So you put out this intention backed by all these spirit beings, and it's in the world. It's that information's out there, and the world's going to respond in kind. There's going to be this Aini, this reciprocity that happens. But you have to develop that awareness, I think, before you start to really value the tradition.
So you've already spoken kind of a lot in different aspects of the Qero traditions, but if someone was to come to you and just kind of ask for a brief overview, or who are the Qeros, what would you say is, kind of where they're coming from? I mean, obviously the Andes, but maybe if you're able to speak a bit about, again, to what degree you know, but their history, who they are, how they view the world, and what are maybe some of their main tenets. I mean, how they view healing, how they view things like initiation, how they set up societies, like what are the roles that they're playing, and also maybe for you, like why and how you found such a connection with them, because you also tried, it seems like a lot of different things, and you walked a lot of different paths, but it really seems like this is the tradition that's really spoken to you, and kind of this lineage that you really seem to be connected to and went quite deeply in, and now in a way are kind of carrying the torch of that. So what was it about that system that you found to be so beautiful for yourself?
Good question. First of all, I will say I've been studying this tradition for 20 years, and I feel like I just have a drop in the bucket. But I will tell you, what I know. But let me start from the more personal. I didn't really seek out the Qero. It kept coming to me. I was interested in shamanism, and by a strange set of circumstances, I ended up at this talk by Alberto. And I'm like, okay, well, that seems like a good way to go. And when I went to Peru with him, a few years into my training, and I was assisting, I think, still with him. I was an assistant. There was sort of this hierarchy of teaching with him. So the first, you come in as an assistant, you volunteer, you just kind of help keep everything going. And eventually you can work into being a lead teacher, at least when he did it in person a long time ago. Now it's all online. So he doesn't need all that kind of structure. But back then he did. And I was an assistant, and I went to Peru, and I decided to purchase a mastana, a mesa cloth, from one of the Pacos. And he's a Paco that's very well known, and he sold me one, and then I said, could you give it a blessing, please? And he said something in Quechua, blah, 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 and I'm like, and I looked around and I said, what did he say? And what he said was, his name was Don Humberto, and he said, you are going to be a teacher of this tradition. He said, it's not going to happen right away, it's going to take a little while. He goes, but you're going to be a teacher of this tradition. And I went, wow, okay. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting have a good life, like blessings on your way. And I went, isn't that interesting? Okay. And so then I went back to teaching with Alberto, and I got, I worked my way up through his system and became a lead teacher. And then I started my own school, and, I taught what I knew. And then again, Joan, I took Joan's online class, and I was like, yeah, I just want to, go deeper with this. And she's like, come learn the tradition. I want you to, would you be willing to go deeper on this? I'm like, okay. Like it keeps pulling me in ways that I didn't envision, in a bigger way than I envisioned. And like, I keep saying yes, because I know you have to. I know that's the right answer. And so, interestingly, with Joan, when she gave me the initiations, we do these online, she gave me the initiation into the lineages, and she said, stay on Zoom afterwards. And I go, okay. So I stayed on Zoom afterwards, and she goes, the weirdest thing happened. She goes, I rarely see Don Benito, which is Juan Nunez de Prado's primary teacher, the person, that taught him all this stuff. He said, she goes, I rarely seen Don Benito has died. He's been dead since the 80s, I think. She goes, I rarely see him in any kind of vision. She goes, but he came through when I was giving you the lineage initiation karpai. And I went, wow, that's fascinating. So there's this sense that I keep having this, I keep being drawn in. And there's a part of me that's always been, I'm not Qero. Who am I to represent their tradition? But on the other hand, apparently I am somebody to represent their tradition. And to come back to a little bit more into the me part of it, I was raised in Alaska, which has those same huge, tall mountains all around it, apus. And recently, I was given a bear, a black bear skin that came from Alaska, and it was as a gift. Someone just said, "You're a shaman, you should have this." It came from Alaska, and I'm like, "What am I going to do with a bear skin from Alaska?" And suddenly, I had this whole download from all the apus in Alaska. Like, remember all the apus who've been holding you all this time. All the mountains, apus are mountains, and I went, oh, and I just had this sense of whatever the division between me and the tradition was dissolved. I was like, well, I'm this white girl from, California, and there's the Andes. And then I just went, something just happened, and I went like, oh, yeah, I teach this. Who is this person that thinks she's in the way, right? Who is this person? And I need to get rid of her. So that's my kind of sense. It just calls me. And then the other way that it calls me is the whole psychedelic physics thing. In my youth, I saw that the universe was created out of these energetic patterns that were intelligent, which told me that there was a matrix of intelligence that we were all a part of. I couldn't figure out how to study it. I found it in physics, like, oh yeah, there it is. They're saying there's an intelligence that's right there, that's in the air, that's created, you can't see in everyday life. So the Andean tradition of saying everything is connected, we come from this conscious living Kelsai Pacha. We're learning how to engage it, how to use it, has been just right in parallel with what I already have been curious about from the beginning, and who knows, which came first, the chicken or the egg. So that's sort of my how I come to it. The Andean tradition it's more than the Qero. Back before the 1500s, in the 1500s, the Spaniards came and they conquered the Inca, and before that, the Inca Empire was stretched from Peru all the way down to Chile. There were all kinds of different tribes that gathered together under this one umbrella called the Inca Empire. And part of their tradition was to incorporate all the different gods and all the different teachings and all the different tribes under one umbrella called the Inca. And implicit in there was an acceptance of all the different tribes and not trying to convert anybody to anybody else's perspective. And there's a lot of different things you can say about them. One of the things Juan says is they came to the world to bring us munai, to bring us love. The Westerners, the European people, came to bring us thought, yachai. The North Americans are more like Yankai, the doers that get things done, make things, create things. And all three of those powers are important for the development of the human collective, the human consciousness, the human being that's going forward. There's a story about all that. But in any event, the Inca Empire at its base has that all these different tribes can be part of it. And we incorporate all these different teachings, and it's not either or. And when you get to the high levels of the Andean traditions, they're saying this. They're saying, can you hold multiple truths at the same time? Can you hold this place of love for other people at the same, for people that bother you, people you don't like? Can you still love them? Can they still be your brother? All these things are the things that pull me in to the tradition. And it is, I took that first class with Alberto, and he was talking about shamanism and quantum mechanics, and it's still at the root. I would say shamanism, quantum mechanics, and consciousness. These are the things I've always been interested in, and it's part of the Andean tradition. It's just implied. They are like the applied neuroscientists and the applied physicists of the indigenous traditions in my position.
This idea, I think, is really important, which is this idea of holding multiple truths to be true at the same time. And we also seem to be living in a world that seems to be quite divided. I mean, all over the world, it seems to be moving in that direction. And it seems like one of those things is that we're not able to do that. We're not able to hold multiple truths to be true at the same time. I mean, that's kind of the nature of division, is it's black and white. I'm right and you're wrong. I'm good and you're bad. But to be able to see things from another point of view, even whether we agree with it or not, but to see the validity of someone else's point of view, to see the validity of the other side of the same coin, to be able to say that maybe what I think is true and also what someone else thinks is true, and where is the meaning behind that. And I think that also goes back to this idea of love. You know, that's very much this idea of love is this non-separation. There's a union, there's a unifying, there's a seeing myself in someone else, being able to hold them within my energetic field. Is that something that you found to be, because you've said that twice, and so I find that really interesting, this idea of holding truths at the same time. Is that something you found with the Qero, that idea?
Absolutely. And just to come back to your earlier question, this is, where I would start with somebody is you are invited to be a part of this tradition, right? And they are very much about sharing their tradition, about saying, one of the tenets of their tradition is the guy that's the fastest up the top of the mountain turns back and helps the slowest up, because they're very communal, because it's about, you have to love each other, you're not going to survive. You have to oversee each other's differences, or you're not going to survive. And it's actually a medicine of the times right now, because we are all so divided. And it is very much about being able to hold multiple truths at the same time. They have a way of breaking down things into kind of energetic structures, and they will say, like, two things that are the same are called mesinton. Like two women are mesinton, two men are mesinton, but a man and a woman are they wouldn't say they're opposite, they would say they're complements of each other, and those are yanantan. And so part of the tradition is learning how to harmonize mesinton things. So the harmonization in mesinton relationships are, you have to deal with the competition. I'm this and you're that, and who's better? And that creates hucha in that place of trying to, it downgrades your sami to be stuck in those sort of patterns. But the yanantan piece is the bigger learning piece. How can I live in harmony with a complement, whether the complement is another gender, another race, another political perspective, another belief system, any of these things, another religion. Part of their tradition is not to say, you have to convert to me. We have to be mesinton. It says, you be you, I'll be me, and let's find this way of bridging it and harmonizing so that we can complement each other and bring a better thing into the world by the fact that you have that and I have this. And so just part of their tradition is this is sort of tools that we don't have in our culture of learning to embrace the differences and learning to hone harmony. It's called a hapu, between yanantan things, between different things, different beliefs, different people, different races, all these things. And of course, munai, love, is that thing that enables all that. I can see who you are. I don't necessarily like you. I don't necessarily agree you, but I love you. You're a fellow human being. You're my brother. You're my sister.
You also mentioned this idea a couple times, which I think is also really important. And I think you used the word choice, which is similar to this idea of volition. It was kind of in this reference of not being a victim. And part of being a victim is also this idea that we don't have a choice, like someone or something or, something outside myself is dictating my life and I have no power, I have no choice. It's interesting because it also has to do with this idea of free will, which is also something that's very much debated as well, like whether we have free will. But kind of from my understanding of these indigenous cultures, they very much speak about this idea of free will. In fact, like the idea of the human, that the highest honor that a human can do is to be a creator. That's to be in the image of God, and God has free will. It has volition. It's literally the creator. It decided to create. But it's interesting because it also, this idea of choice, of volition, also has to do, with these kind of, I think, very shamanic or healing ideas about bringing order, bringing direction, bringing alignment, which also is like etymologically related to ideas of wholeness, of healing. All of these things are somehow interrelated. So yeah, it just, for me, that's always such an important thing. And I'm wondering if you can maybe speak a bit more, because you also mentioned that a couple of times, that from your time with the Qero, they really spoke or emphasized about this idea of choice, that we have choice, and even that shift, as we were talking about, that shift of perception, that shift of cosmovision, it can be so healing. I mean, even as, like I was just saying, I mean, that's literally etymologically, choice is somehow related to the idea of healing. I mean, it's a similar root.
Yeah, there's a concept in the Andean tradition called karpai, which means power or personal power. And part of your evolution up those 7 steps of the conscious patinyan is building your personal power. And your personal power comes from being able to take ownership of what you do and don't do, of being able to hold that space, be responsible. So it is very much a part of the tradition that there is free will, that you are an individual. If you don't express who you are, who will? You're part. This is the part of creation that came through as Christina. That's the part that came through as Jason. You have to do what you do. I have to do what I do, and we have to find that and be that instead of, all the things that we're supposed to do. So. Victimhood keeps us stuck in that place of not having any power, not having any personal power. And you cannot be an effective Paco if you're stuck in victimhood. Victimhood is a contractive kind of energetic stance. It's everything's coming at me, I have to go into fear. It's not being able to stand up and puff yourself up and say, fill your bubble with Sami and go, I've got this. Not only have I got this, I can help you get this. And there are levels of reach that the Paco has, and this is part of the steps up the conscious patinyan, to being able to hold bigger and bigger levels of reach. At the smallest level, you're just working on yourself, then you're working on your ayu, your tribe, your town, your city, you become more and more able until you have global reach. And you can't have global reach as a victim. You have to be able to work and make choice and learn from the consequences. And all of this creates personal power. Whereas if you stay in victim and everybody's doing it to you, you never learn those lessons. You never learn from consequence. You end up sort of end up in these enabling kind of relationships where you need a rescuer if you're a victim, and you need a perpetrator, and you're working through these sort of cycles, these archetypal cycles from all 3 of those things, instead of coming up through the middle and going, I've got this. This is mine to navigate. I'm going to have problems. I'm going to have high moments. I'm going to navigate all of those. I'm going to learn from my mistakes. Instead of, so something can happen to somebody, absolutely. In trauma, something happens to people, but there's a place where you move on. You can stay in victimhood, and you can stay in that suffering, or you can move into a place of, what can I learn from that thing that happened? What did I develop? What strengths did I develop in myself to endure, to not have that happen again, to be a stronger person, to take my medicine out in the world? What medicine did I develop by having gone through that circumstance or those circumstances? And so you shift out of victim into expression of your Inca seed, into that was just a teaching moment so that I could pull through from my Inca seed that part of myself that needed to be developed so I could fully express who I am, so I have more and more and more karpai.
You mentioned in the beginning, I don't know if you got around to it, but you said there was a story you were going to get back to about how the Apus helped the Pacos in their work. Is that something you could share?
Yes, there's a story of when the conquistadors came, the Spaniards came. They wanted to wipe out all the people that were there, especially the spiritual people, the traditional, the priests, because one of the first tenets of changing a cultural paradigm is to take out the religion, and so they had killed off a lot of the people at the more accessible levels like Cusco, which is only 14,000 feet, and they started going up into the mountains to go to bring to take down the Qero, to kill them off, and the Qero were warned by the Apus that this was going to happen. And the Apus said, the mountains said, because they speak to the mountains are wise beings. The mountains said, build up columns of rock along the path to Qeros, to the villages of Qeros. Build that up now, because they're coming. And so they're like, okay. So they built these big columns of rocks. And as the conquistadors started coming up the mountain, there was an earthquake. And all those rocks went down, and they spilled down, and they pummeled all the Spaniards and killed them. And the last few that were alive flew into a lake and drowned. And so there's this real sense that they're in cahoots with the Apus, that the Apus inform them, they protect them, they help them with their work, they help them survive, they give them wisdom. That was the story I was going to tell.
Would you say that's one of the main kind of objectives about that practice, is really beginning to refine one's sensitivities, to open our perception to these forces of nature, like the mountains, like the water, like the wind, like the earth, to really be able to learn from that? Because this also isn't such a foreign concept. I mean, even in the country that you're coming from, that I'm from, the US, I mean, our founding fathers, when you read them, they would often say that the highest form of knowledge didn't come from a book, it doesn't come from man, it doesn't come from the sciences. They would say it comes from nature. And, I think for so many people, we've really moved away from that. Like, we view the epitome of knowledge as coming from man, from humans, from books, from science. And yet, even for the Greeks, like they had two words for knowledge, and the highest form of knowledge was gnosis, and it wasn't something that was learned in a book. It was something that was experiential, that they would actually say came from spirit. I mean, even in our language, we use these words like inspired. It means to be filled with spirit, and that's the highest form of knowledge. I mean, true art is when you're inspired, and it's usually that inspiration isn't coming from the realm of humans. It's coming from the dream space. I mean, even very famous scientists like Einstein is kind of infamously known for kind of his revelations came through this dream space or this daydream space, and it's a very common thing. So do you think that's one of the real kind of beauties or powers of the Qero teaching, is the kind of these techniques, these tools to really be able to refine ourselves, to become kind of in a way more of a channel, more of an antenna, more of just an open human being, to be able to receive more from all of these gifts that are around us?
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. What we're trying to do in the tradition is be Ranti, same as Masinton, with the creative force, so that we are its hands. We are an extension of it instead of separate from it. There are lots of different ways that you break down religions and traditions, and some, you're subservient to the sky god. But in this sense, you have a bit of it in you. You are it. You're part of creation. You are one of the hands and legs of creation. And so, yes, it's becoming aware enough of the way that you limit yourself and your humanity to be able to embrace your divinity. And the way that you said it in terms of experience and experiences it's a really important point, because experience has way more bandwidth than a thought, than intellectualism. Experience has the mix of your emotions and your aha and it landed, whereas thought just has this much smaller bandwidth of information. And so when we experience something, it will change us. You can read things and they can change you. You can hear thoughts and they can change you. But when you have an experience, your whole being is involved in that. You're having a visceral experience. And so you shift, you create a truth from that. You can create truths by things that you read in a book, but they're tentative. You can uncreate. I read another book and maybe this is true. But when you have an experience of something, when you have Pachamama show up and you can feel her and she talks to you and you have this sort of come to Jesus moment with her, that's real to you. That creates a new truth. And all the different parts of nature are spirit beings that you can have these experiences with. The wind is a being. So is the sun, so is the moon, so are the trees. They're all beings. And when you can open up to that bandwidth of experiencing relationship with them, then you are getting knowledge from a different place. Absolutely. It's not just kind of repeating what other humans have said. What other humans have said is great, and it can take us to another level, or it can titillate us and make us open. But to get to that next level of engagement, of living as a hand of creation, you have to be in connection with it. And it's a beautiful thing, because if you stay in the intellect, you're more egoically driven. And when you can go past the intellect into that place of experience and into that place of connection to the spiritual realm, you're part of the whole unfolding of things. Now, there's a tricky place in there when the ego decides that it has done that when it hasn't. And it's like, I do all these things, and I know all these things, and I have all these relationships, and it's, this is who I am, and I'm great because I do this. It's different than just being in that vibration of being in the ocean. Feeling the water, feeling the waves, feeling the currents, knowing that you're bobbing with that water, and you're getting tossed by those currents, and you're in it, you're part of it, and then knowing you have some facility within that, not a whole lot, but a certain amount. It's different than being on the shore going, yes, I understand waves are nice, there's some wind that comes and takes the wave and makes it do all these things. Getting in the water is a whole different thing. And that's, I think, that what this tradition is all about, is getting aware, becoming aware enough of who you're not, how you've discreated yourself in some sense, so that you can really step into the water and go, I'm part of creation. And as part of creation, what do I want to do? How do I want to bring through whatever humanity needs? Because right now, humanity's in a little bit of a crunch here, I think. It's kind of in a lot of chaos. So in some sense, this tradition is beautiful. I think there are lots of traditions that are, but this is the one that I'm in. And that knowing that comes from experience is essential to shamanic traditions, and essential to this one in particular, and developing your perception. One of the first things we teach is, can you feel the energy? Because in our mind, we're like, yes, that's nice, there's energy. Yes, there's tree beings. Yes, that's nice, there's the wind. Our intellect is going to reduce it all to words and concepts. And what we do in the tradition is we open up the bandwidth to an experiential realm. And so I'm really glad that you brought that through.
In a lot of traditions, kind of as you were saying, that there is a lot of things that are passed down, a lot of intellect, and we read books and we go to lectures, or we listen to the Dalai Lama or the Pope. And one of the things that's really interesting about a lot of these traditions, these kind of more, again, for lack of a better word, shamanic traditions, is kind of as you said in the beginning. You said the Pacos or the Qeros, they're not big talkers. And it's something that's very interesting, and I think for a lot of Westerners, very difficult to kind of bridge those worlds. I mean, it was something I noticed a lot when I was working with the Shipibo in the jungle, is a lot of foreigners would come down and they wanted to have these kind of intellectual talks with the Shipibo, and that's not them. And I think, often people look at that as somehow being maybe like less evolved, or maybe unscientific in a way, because there's not these systems in place. And yet often the answers to those things in a way are more refined, because as you said, they're not coming from an intellectual place. They're not coming from a place of rote or repetition or taking what someone says, but it's very much putting you in an experience. And much like as you said, and I think it's something very beautiful and very powerful that few people really have a chance to experience. Kind of as you were saying, of sitting in those ceremonies where they just kept doing these same things and making these offerings. But often there's something that begins to drop away. And as you said, a different level of perception opens, or a different understanding that's moving beyond the mind, but something that becomes very visceral, very, very heartfelt. And there's very much a shift of our whole being, of how we look at the world, of what we consider to be real or not real, or true or not true. And it's something that's very rare that we experience. And in that way, and it's a word that I think is being more used, but still probably not widely accepted, which is science, which is that actually these traditions are very scientific, but the science behind it is, it's a different science. It's a science of the experience of, instead of being told like this is this, it's here's this ceremony, or here's this cup of medicine, or go up into the mountains for a number of days and be with the wind, be with the water, and come back. And what did you find? And there's something very powerful about that. That is very scientific. It's almost like a lost science of these systems are actually very complex and very deep, but just maybe not in a way that most of our minds is able to grasp at first.
Yeah, I completely agree. What that made me think of is it's empirical. It's truth that you develop through experience. And what science likes to say is you have to repeat an experiment over and over again, and if you come out with the same results, then we can say then we can form a theory and we can say this is true. And it's not that way in the shamanic traditions. There's a lot of subjectivity. There's a lot of your experience and what your truth is. That said, the other side of the traditions is there's a tradition. This is a thing that I've thought about in terms of science versus the traditional kinds of things. In science, the way we keep things pure is through peer review. Your peers challenge your perspective. If you can, defend your perspective, if you can have enough experiments to defend it, if you can, if it survives all the peer, like the barrage of I'm going to take you down from your peers, and that those facts still rise, then we go, okay, we're going to say that's probably true. So this is the way that a lot of, this is the beauty of science, is that it's not just correlative. You can't just say, well, this happened and this happened, so they must be related. You have to show that they're related, and you have to show that they're related repeatedly. And then we go, okay, that's a fact, and this is going to be part of our tenets, and we're going to pass this down as part of the tradition. In in the shamanic traditions, we have lineages that teach practices for people to have experiences in, and whatever doesn't work gets weeded out also, sort of like peer review. Like if that's a bogus theory, that's not going to happen. So the parts of the tradition that work the best keep getting passed down and passed down and passed down. So you hone these traditions into having this sort of set of truth and tenets that is more experiential and is based on subjectivity, but within a container of this is the way that we do things, and this is how we foster this growth and this understanding by this, these tried and true methods and practices.
Yeah, beautiful. So you're now the director, the founder of something called the Austin Shamanic Center. Can you speak a bit more about that, about the work that you do, that the center does, and what was the impetus behind that, and kind of what's happening there?
Yeah, it's just what I created. I left Alberto in 2013, and it was time to go. I'd been there for 10 years. I had taught. There wasn't any place else to go. He was making some big changes in his teaching and his staff, and it was just time for me to go and be on my own. And I was living in California at the time, in Southern California, San Diego area. Not a great place to try and introduce shamanic practices. There's a lot of, or at least at that time, there were a lot of fundamentalist Christians there who would, really push against anything that was called shamanic, and file it in demonic. And so I had a lot of trouble trying to I had a yoga studio at the time, and I had a lot of trouble trying to integrate that in. Yoga was hard enough at that time. So I was looking for a place where there was a community that was more open to these traditions. And I had a couple students in one of my last classes with Alberto from Austin, and they said, you should come to Austin and check it out. It's a very spiritual but very intelligent community. And I said, okay, I'll check it out. I came, I liked it. I said, okay, this is where I'm going to move. I'm going to start my own school. It was sort of brave on my part to do all that without knowing more than a couple people. But I did. And I started a school, and I called it Austin Shamanic Center. I didn't really know what to call it. And I went to this marketing company. I'm like, this is what I do. What should I call this? And they're like, let's call it Austin Shamanic Center. I'm like, all right. It's because it's easy to find. It's easy to get into. But the place where I run into trouble is people want journeys, and they want, sweats, and they want all kinds of things that are North American, considered shamanic. And I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm doing the Andean stuff. So I taught sort of my own version of neuroscience, physics, and Alberto's version of the tradition. And then I met Joan, and I'm like, oh. When I met Joan, I met her before COVID, and I fell into the fire in 2019, and it was after I had started working with her, and there's just this transition happened, and the space that I was working out of over COVID was taken away. Joan said, get online, start doing this. And so there was a big shift into teaching the Andean, because I couldn't teach the things I was teaching in person online very well. They were experiential, kind of sit in circles and do things. And so, but the way that Joan was teaching the Andean tradition was very, very easily, adaptable to online teaching. And she just scooped me up and said, you got this, kid, go ahead and do it. And she introduced me to Juan and Yvonne. Because it was during COVID, they were available on Zoom. So we spent long hours talking to them, and I got to run all the things I knew about what I had learned from Alberto. And I go, well, how do you see this? Well, how do you see this? Well, how do you see this? And was able to sort of piece together what Alberto had put together, and how he had put together, and why he had put it together, and then what the original teachings were. Kind of, we pull those out, and then started teaching online. And then I've had a healing practice all this time. I've always been a healer. So I updated the way I heal so that I use the traditional energy tuning practices, and the other thing that Alberto introduced into the system were chakras. In the Andean tradition, they don't have chakras; they have nyawis, and nyawis are eyes, and they're very different. They don't spin; they're not wheels. Excuse me. Chakras come out of the Indian, the Vedic traditions from India, and the Pacos don't have these spinning wheels, but they have these perceptive lenses. So part of the tradition is to clear these eyes so that you can perceive with all these different capacities. Each eye has different kinds of capacities. So I started to incorporate that into my healing work. So at this point, I do like 3 days of healing work, and then I teach often on weekends. I'm currently writing a book on freeze and how to heal using, the premise really is that healing is a spiritual endeavor, and you can't just heal the mind. You can't just heal the brain. You have to have it's a spiritual experience. And to thaw from freeze, you're going to have to step into the spiritual realm. So I'm writing that book also. And that's sort of where I am.
Beautiful. And if people are interested in learning more about that or contacting you, is there a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way is through my website, which is info@AustinShamaniccenter.com. And just send us an email or go, read through and see what interests you. I have a whole section called services. I have workshops, I have healing, I have private consultations, I have all kinds of things that I offer. And you can just kind of pick from there. You can send me an email and say, hey, I'm here. I don't have a lot of spare time to chat with people. I get a lot of people like, hey, I just want to meet you, I want to chat, let's go have coffee. I'm like, I have almost all my time spoken for. It's not like I'm too busy for you. It's just I already committed myself very deeply into all the things that I am doing. But happy to hear from people. Happy to. Yeah.
Well, wonderful, Christina. Well, we're coming up on 2.5 hours. But this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing and just sharing your background and your perspective and your life's work and just everything you've done. And, I find these traditions very fascinating, and I think the audience really does. And if they haven't heard of these traditions, will find them very fascinating. So again, thank you so much for your time. It was a really beautiful interview and really beautiful just hearing from you and connecting with you a little bit, and I think the audience is really going to get a lot out of this episode. And yeah, is there anything we touched on that or that we didn't touch on that you'd like to say before we bring this to a close?
I'm feeling complete at this point, but thank you, Jason, very, very much for doing the interview, for reaching out, for following through on Joan's suggestion. It's an honor to talk with you. I know you talk with all kinds of amazing people, and I feel lucky to be among them. So thank you very much for the interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, and thank you very much again for coming on. And I really wish you the best in your continued journey. I think it's beautiful what you're doing, kind of bringing this work out into the public. And it's, I think, really medicine of our times. As you said, I think there's very much a reason why these traditions are moving out into the world, and it's because they're very much needed. People need them, and also to keep them alive. And I think it's beautiful, kind of this act of bridge building that you're doing. And it's also very much an Indigenous prophecy of the times we're living in, which is these people who are able to build bridges and to share and to bring medicines from different parts of the world together. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for your time and sharing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Christina. For me, it was really a pleasure to sit down with her, to get to know her a little bit better, to have her share in her story. And I really hope you all gain some insight and knowledge from her. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really amazing way of doing that, of being able to give back. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a super helpful way. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for, and also all of those tiers give different things back. So things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. To all of the patrons, to all the people supporting that way, as always, thank you very much for your support. And if you're able to do that, thank you very much in advance. If you're not able to do that, always just helping with some of the small things that really help to drive the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving any questions or comments in the comment section. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review is also a really big help. My next guest, I have a guy, Jonathan Ross, I think coming on the next episode. He's done some really interesting work on this idea of enlightenment and speaking with some really interesting people about what that means. He's also written a new book about MDMA therapy. I think he's also one of the kind of pioneers in that field, so that should be a really interesting conversation. I'm also trying to get on a Russian Orthodox priest to talk about Christianity and kind of just some of the more maybe pagan influences of that as well. I'm really hoping that works out. And I have a number of guests. I can't think of them all. There's a good friend of mine, Jeanette, who I'm hoping to bring on to speak about kind of the crossover between Buddhism and plant medicine. So that should be a really interesting conversation. And a few other guests lined up as well, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head. But as always, I hope to continue to bring on some really fascinating people. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.